So today I'm going to be not just touching on, or should I say, dipping my toe in the water of reconstructions, but it's about the process of being an archaeologist who's now an archaeological illustrator, and kind of how we go about creating the visuals for TV, museum displays, popular publications, newsletters, and hopefully it'll give you a kind of better understanding of why I'm kind of losing my hair probably quicker than I should. 51. So the aim of the presentation is to kind of look at the creative process that's involved and to try and understand some of the methodology behind kind of what I actually do in creating the kind of visuals, the final concepts for the general public and academics alike, and look at the main ways that we can develop these visuals and hopefully stimulate ideas about the past and kind of further discussion. Because what I like to think is that part of my job is to push academics out of the comfort zone as much as possible, because they have an idea what they want in a visual, and we have a certain amount of data sets to work from. But I like to kind of question why, why have you asked for this to be put in? Gary had some slides before, and I said I wasn't going to put these in, but we had some lovely visuals, some lovely watercolors on screen, and you had a lovely view of the Elbert Bridge, and underneath that was a cart. And as an artist, you kind of create a visual sometimes, and you might put specific elements in just because it looks nice. And part of the job I have as a reconstruction artist is kind of be mindful not to do that sometimes, because it can interpret sites in a slightly different way. For the general public who don't know the site inside out, you've got to be very mindful about what you position and what you put in reconstructions. So it's a challenge. It's a fun challenge, but the idea is to kind of create a very simple image of a site as it may have once been. Okay, it's a snapshot. It's like kind of having a very, 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 very old iPhone and someone taking a photograph of it. It's a very, very quick snapshot through time. And it's dependent on what the specialist wants to show. Is it down to the weather? Do they want the reconstruction in the winter? Why? What's important about that? So you have a lot of questions kind of which I like to fire back quite quickly to the academics involved. And hopefully the final visual kind of helps bring archaeology to life. And that's kind of really, really important. But the rationale behind kind of what I do is usually simply, what is it you're trying to show? What is it of, and all these data sets that you have from data structure reports, monographs, what is it that you're trying to synthesize down into one simple image? And that's quite key. And a lot of academics kind of oh, I'm not really sure. But they have an idea, they want to reconstruct in the first place, usually because they have a bit of money to give me, which is nice. And it means I can hopefully do a job. So the aim's to kind of partially explain the value of reconstructions in the archaeological process as a kind of an end point. This idea that it's probably one of the final things from any kind of research that you will see. The aim is to kind of open up the subject to the audience, as wide the audience as possible. I don't like this idea that you can sometimes kind of restrict it to just academics. You want to have children involved and get enthused, because myself, being based in the Northeast, I love to go to kind of museums and along Hadrian's Wall and look at some of the reconstructions in Ronald Embleton. So some of you might know whose reconstructions are kind of slightly dated now, but kind of having that awe and that kind of inspiration to think, wow, is that what it looked like at the time? Because a lot of the time, a lot of academic papers are kind of closed off to the general public, and they kind of, maybe they don't want to kind of delve into it, and they should, but they kind of want to have a visual to look at quite quickly and get an idea of a sense of time and place. And my aim, hopefully, is to kind of interpret all of that information and act as a spokesman for kind of a group of people, which kind of involves academics, anthropologists, historians, just to name a few, and kind of get all of their ideas and kind of what's in their head and all the data that they've been researching for years, kind of put down in one very simple visual. The one simple visual sometimes can take months, can take years. Artists like myself sometimes like to work from a really rigid brief. Okay, somebody will have a really kind of strong idea of what they want. I don't like to work like that at all. I like to have a very kind of an open discussion, this kind of engaging debate with academics and the general public as well, as to kind of what you're trying to show. And a lot of research disciplines get involved. So the idea is you try to combine as much knowledge and information as possible, and questioning, which I like a lot, of why do you put this in? What's important about this? To try and develop this kind of very strong visual, kind of striking image. I've got some, this isn't kind of anywhere near any water, by the way, really. It's kind of Hadrian's Wall. But the idea is to kind of hopefully putting flesh on the bare bones. I know Hadrian's Wall, which is kind of close to here, is kind of still standing in a lot of places. But the idea is that some of the images kind of just to represent some archaeological data which isn't there anymore. So on screen now, I've got a kind of an image of a box burial, which was found in Carlisle. And the pottery was found there. The box remnants were found there. The grave cut was there. And then we needed to interpret that in a very, very simple, quick visual that's just been published this week in a publication, monograph publication, to kind of show a sense of what it might have been. Now, this is a very kind of stylized, cleaned up way. We know with those archaeologists, it's very muddy. It's not going to be that clean. Nothing's going to be that shiny. But it's a way to try and synthesize into a very simplistic format a lot of information in just a very simple visual image. So again, this is another reconstruction of the cutaway. So the front's kind of removed slightly. And the pot which is actually included in this is actually the pottery which was found in the ground, which people like myself and Gary, who illustrate, we hand draw the pot. Those of you who came on the course yesterday kind of found out how to do this. So all of the data sets that we put in reconstructions are actual physical archaeological data from the site. It's not just a random pot that we've kind of found somewhere and kind of put in. So the data sets are really, really important. Now, as I've got on screen here, this is the kind of hand-drawn element of the pot I've got, and then I've turned these into kind of 3D models in 3D programs and applied textures to them. Then they're taken and they're kind of put in different reconstructions, such as one I was working on this week, which is a reconstruction of a Roman kiln with pottery in it. But again, this is an idea. This is kind of just a very quick snapshot through to kind of give a very, very quick visual idea of what possibly could be happening within the reconstruction. And this kind of leads into this idea of the Crannog, which is what we're going to get into. But I just want to give you kind of some idea of the snapshot of the kind of data processes which get involved in kind of compiling images like this. So we have a kind of Crannog on screen. The process is still ongoing. It's not going to get published probably till next September. It's for a place in Blacklock in Scotland. And part of the visual I've got is the kind of standalone Crannog, and this is going to kind of be in the background of the reconstruction. But the beauty about reconstructions done digitally now is you can use cameras to zoom in and kind of set a kind of an image that you want and render it away. When I first started, everything was done by hand, and you'd spend months sometimes creating a watercolor or a gouache painting. And you'd sit down with a specialist and you get all the information from them, and you'd say, "Is this what you want?" And they go, "Yeah. Are you sure?" "Yeah." And then you go away and do it, and you come back and go, "I love it, but could you just move it up just a little?" Yeah. Whereas now you can just move the camera and re-render it out. But part of the problem which comes from that is actually being able to set all of the environmental constraints and all the data sets that you get around it, which isn't easy. So sometimes you have a kind of set idea, this kind of bias that you have as an artist in your head of what a Roman gateway might look like based on evidence that we've got. And usually it's from Arbea and South Shields, based on the Roman fort, which is fully reconstructed there. And you've probably all seen images of it online if you've not been. So a lot of the interpretations over the last 10 years, or the ones I've done, a lot of the time the academics go, "Oh yeah, if you could just base it on existing evidence, because that's someone's put the neck out and kind of gone, yeah, that's probably what it would have looked like." We're still not 100% sure. But a lot of the reconstructions that you have, you got to remember that you're kind of working on, and they're not set in stone. So it's movable. This idea that you're setting a visual, but hopefully it's open to interpretation, hopefully open to change. So it's not something which is frozen in time and is not changeable at all. So the idea is that I'd like to think that people would question the reconstructions and ask specific questions as to why certain elements or certain features in the drawings themselves. And then you can kind of move it forward. So the idea is that you're trying to convey a very complex message and hopefully make heritage experience more enjoyable. So I know I'm on last today presenting, but hopefully there's a lot of nice kind of visuals so you can kind of switch off and there's not too many charts and things to look at. But hopefully it helps to stimulate debate amongst academics and the general public alike. What I like to do if I get a display piece put in, I like to go there when it comes and put in display, not the first day, but a few days later, and just stand and watch people and watch the reactions to my reconstructions. I don't kind of say, "Oh, I did this," but I like to kind of just stand and see the context that they kind of think it's in, usually with the interpretation of the material in front of it, and look at the reaction. Because that to me makes either my job worthwhile. If they shake their head and walk away, I know I'm not doing something right. I know I need to change what I'm doing. But hopefully it kind of helps a very, very diverse audience to understand and engage in archaeological remains. And that is really hard. What I like to do, or what I have done in the past, is take physical archaeological remains, because as a kid, I used to love wandering around sites and looking at sites like this Mithraistic temple in Northumberland. And I kind of had no idea what would have been in there, what would have been going on. So the idea is that you try to interpret the material so people can actually see and visually go to the site and look at the remains which are still there, but then give them an idea of what might have been happening at the time, a kind of snapshot. Luckily, the guy's got clothes on. He didn't originally, but, you know, why he's blindfolded, I don't know. But the idea is you try to kind of stimulate thought in people who might just look at things and think, oh, that's just a pile of stones. That's not really interesting. Hopefully, you kind of say, well, actually, this is a really interesting site at one point. And these are the remains, and this is what possibly might have happened or might have been going on at the time. So they hopefully develop ideas about the past, but it's a huge, long, protracted, drawn-out, detailed collaboration between lots and lots of specialists. I wouldn't necessarily include myself as a specialist because I just colour in for a living, but people who kind of really do some proper research. So you've got historians, artists, archaeologists, anthropologists, ecologists, all contribute to kind of their own area of expertise into the final output. The problem I have sometimes is trying to synthesize all that data in my head and get an idea of what I think people want or kind of think people want to see. And that's really not that easy. And I'm probably going to be the first person, hopefully, in the history of NAS to try and shoehorn Harry Potter into a presentation in a few slides' time to try and get you to understand that. My daughter thought that was a really bad idea, but she's 13. But the final success of what we do kind of depends on the skill of somebody like myself, because if you don't kind of convey a time of sense and place and I guess mystery sometimes in an illustration, then it doesn't have any purpose whatsoever. So usually every work I start on starts and ends with a dialogue. Initially, it's a dialogue between the specialists themselves, usually around a table, hopefully with coffee and biscuits. But at the end, like I said before, it's a silent one. So whether that's a kind of front cover of publication or a book, somebody looks at the picture and kind of tries to develop an understanding of what the site was like. And to me, that's key, that's important. Because this idea, I can't be there to defend the illustration all the time. But hopefully kind of people can look at it, and this idea that the silent response I get from people, the kind of stimulus that they're thinking about what the site might have looked like is really, really important. And eventually it's just between the public themselves, whoever the public is, kids, academics, and me, or the reconstruction artist. But behind all of this, you've kind of got a lot of debates going on about, you know, who's commissioned the work, what's the bias behind kind of what they're trying to show, how far should we try and reconstruct the past? It's a really important question, because do we have the right to try and influence what people think the past would have looked like with the evidence that we have? So if you've got only, say, 60 to 80% of the information, should we leave it there, or should we try and add on that final bit to fill in the jigsaw to kind of give a complete picture? What's more important? Is it ultimately down to avoiding interpretation, or is it worth the intervention of actually including a reconstruction which actually makes visible sense to people? Okay, that's a really kind of hard concept to try and get your head around when you're trying to reconstruct something. Where people go, well, it could have been a bit like this, but we're not sure, so maybe leave that out. And you think, well, something needs to be in there. Something needs to kind of show the people this visual representation of either the data or lack of data needs to be in there. So a lot of the time we kind of make it, usually, which is what I call subtle interpretation. So I've never read Harry Potter, by the way, so I do apologize. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair. By the way, everyone at home, I'm not actually reading from a book here. Bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of sellotape, because at times Dudley had punched him in the nose. I had to research who Dudley was last night. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a thin scar on his forehead, which shaped like a bolt of light. Now, everybody knows kind of what Harry Potter looks like. Or do they? Because from that one statement, you got three, I was going to say wildly different interpretations, but they're not, because they're all a boy with dark hair. But these are three different artists, and I include the middle one because obviously the art of making the film's important. This idea that you have three different interpretations from the same statement. Now, you might have three different academics who have the kind of idea of the same statement, but in their head, they have three very different visual ideas of what it should look like. So my idea is to try and combine all that data together and kind of make sure we've got a best fit so everybody's happy, so no one leaves the room in a strop or in a bad mood, because that can happen. We have experimental archaeology, which is massively important, massively influential. And we also have kind of different kinds of reconstructions, different variations on it. We have the Scottish Crannog Centre on Loch Tay, which is really good and really important for the research that we've been doing. And you kind of have some visual interpretations of existing evidence there, and they've reconstructed this a bit like our Roman font and South Shields with the evidence that they've had, and then you have a few reconstructions here. Some are better than others. I apologize, I don't know who they're from, but you have widely different interpretations of what a Crannog would have looked like. You know, are they all on stilts? Are they little island-based things? How they kind of set? What kind of data do we have to work with to kind of reconstruct this? And even in the photographs, you can see the top three there. The middle one's kind of nice blue sky, it's shiny. The others are grey skies. As a reconstruction artist, I have the, I suppose, godlike ability to be able to set the weather, if that makes any sense. And I can make things, but I've got to be very mindful of how I do that, because I don't necessarily want things to be all shiny and sunny all the time, if that's not necessarily what the academics are saying. Well, actually, it might not have always been nice, but it might have been sunny sometimes, or maybe cloudy, and we don't want it snowy because everything's just white and it doesn't work. So you have to kind of appreciate the idea that you try not to put too much of your own influence into an image, to then get other people to have this kind of, I suppose, biased interpretation of what they could actually see. Whatever medium is used, though, all we can do is illustrate using the state of knowledge at the time, which is, as I said before, sometimes weeks, months, years, but the final output needs to be taken into consideration straight away. Is it for a monograph? Is it going to be very small on an A4 piece of paper? Is it going to be used on television? Is it going to be used in presentation, so it's on a huge screen? Is it going to be a kind of static panel in a museum where there's going to be no words with it? And all of that needs to be taken into consideration when you start to kind of put flesh on the bones of a reconstruction. And it can take a long time, and we try to kind of put back what isn't there anymore a lot of the time, what's been taken away by time. And you do have a lot of kind of control of what you can do, and kind of what you're trying to show, but usually you're trying to kind of give it a thought-provoking element to what you're doing. This detailed, prolonged, protracted study of the archaeology and its physical constraints and environments, because I get a lot of LiDAR data sets and maps, and people go, yeah, this would have been really nice. It would have had a really nice kind of walkway through here, we're sure of it. And then you put it in the kind of data sets in the model, and and they're like, oh, actually, that might have been a bit tight. We might have to rethink that. So it kind of hopefully stimulates a lot of kind of debate going forward in the process of working through it. So you kind of you're running with data, which is changing all the time. So you kind of need to make sure that you get to a point where people are kind of happy with where they're staying with the information, and they're not going to change it too much. Because if they change it too much and go, actually, we're going to change our mind now. We think that all these guys in here are going to be wearing bright red clothes with Mickey Mouses. You think, right, okay, that's going to be interesting. But hopefully the benefits is kind of to push specialists, as I said before, out of the comfort zone, because I think it leads to this increased, enhanced human observation of the subject matter. And we did this on the workshops yesterday, this idea where you're studying material, no matter what it is, pottery, small finds, probably longer than anybody's looked at it before since the person who's made it. So when you're reconstructing something, you're reconstructing an image, you're visually staring at this one screenshot of a camera angle, and you're trying to kind of think, okay, well, I kind of know what should be around here, but we need to be mindful that the foreground's not too busy. We've got all the data sets from the kind of the pollen data, so we know what plants were there, but if we put too much in, that's going to distract from what's in the background. And what's really important here, is it the seeds we found in the ground, or is it the cattle in the background, or is it the main focus of not just the archaeology, structural remains, sometimes is it the enviroarchaeology? And you've got to try and kind of soften everything sometimes to make sure that the final visual that you're creating doesn't have an overload of one data set than the other. And a lot of the time that comes down from, you get the site plans, sections, drawings, and they're kind of really helpful, the notepads, the sketchbooks, the photographs from the site. A lot of the time you're kind of working on sites that you've never been to before, you've never been involved in the archaeology before, but it kind of starts to slowly help you build a picture of what potentially the archaeology was like and what you're trying to show in a kind of visual stimulation. The site plans then get refined by people like myself to get put in kind of grey lit reports or monographs. And it's part of the filtering process out, where you're kind of starting to omit data and you're starting to kind of phase out sites, so you kind of know roughly the direction you want to be going in. And it hopefully starts to focus specialists' minds with a concept, this idea of what they're trying to show or what they want the viewer to see, because they can write pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of words, which is great. But ultimately, you want a final visual image, which is just one static image. Sometimes you can have the pitfalls. You can have far too much data. sometimes there's not enough data. The problem I say with far too much data, because you might be thinking, why is that possible? Because it's a bit like if you've got too much to work with, you think you need to include everything. But the synthesizing of the thinning out the data hopefully kind of focuses the specialist minds and kind of streamlines the process and gives them some idea of exactly what they're trying to achieve in the final visual. Sometimes it's not easy with academics. You start to kind of build the initial framework of a reconstruction kind of based on the site plans. So we start to kind of get the dendrochronology data of the timbers, and then you can start to look at the phasings of things and what kind of data sets we used, any physical constraints within the site, kind of parts of the phasing. And then you kind of start to put together what looks like a mood board of sketches and stuff. And you kind of start to reference material, and you kind of pull it all in, and you might give a presentation to the specialist saying, well, this is the kind of thing that's in my head at the moment from the data you give me. Is this the kind of thing you're looking for? 99% of the time, they'll just go, yeah. And then you'll work some sketches up and go, that's not what I thought it was going to be. So the process is a bit like, when you kind of have a kid and you ask them what they want for tea, and they go, I want pizza or something. So you put pizza on, I don't like that kind of pizza. It's a bit like that with academics sometimes, is that they know what they want, but until they actually see it, they don't really know what they want, which can be quite hard. But then we move on to the kind of stage, which is kind of really putting what I call kind of flesh on the bones of this blocking out process, where you visually try to take the site plans and put them in a 3D program and start to kind of build the data sets into something which starts to maybe look like what could have been there. This is an example of one I did from a latrine at Arbea Roman Fort. And I was working with Nick Hodgson on this, and we got the data sets through, and he said, oh, can you put something together? And he made me stop halfway through. He said, actually, it's a lot smaller than we thought the toilet was going to be. Maybe the toilet was just for the commanding officers. We're not sure. Can we pause? So it's still on hold. And this was 10 years ago now. So the idea is that you then give that kind of thought-provoking process back to the people who are working on the data sets, because you give them a visual to look at, which doesn't quite sit right with their site data that they've got based on the information that you have at the time. You kind of start to block out, and then you start to kind of put fancy things in like clouds in the background, and then you kind of set it and you say, is this the kind of thing you want to, are you trying to kind of, what I'm trying to do at this stage is kind of put the flesh on the bones, but block it out where you're starting to get a mood, a sense of things, like a Turner-esque styled colouring on this one, hopefully that's coming through. And then once the kind of people go, yeah, that's fine, then you move on. But the final image is slightly different, because as you can see there, it's lower down. And I thought I'm going to move that slightly more to the center, because the focus on this is the corner round tower. So the idea is I'll put a bit of smoke in the background on this reconstruction to show kind of the visual element of kind of human interaction within the fort itself. But the visual elements kind of are really kind of prolonged, protracted toing and froing back to the specialist, especially when it comes to putting people in reconstructions, because the helmets might not be the right period, because they've changed their mind about what the interpretation might be. But that allows for that kind of discussion to evolve and stimulate further discussion and process with the specialists outside of what I do, which is kind of hopefully what the main aim of a lot of what I'm trying to achieve is. So we'll kind of step back a bit into the Crannogs. We start to get the dendro data across, and these come back. I said there was no charts in this. There is. I apologize, because it's the last presentation of the day. But I don't really look at these, because these are just coloured lines to me. They don't mean anything. And I said to the specialist, kind of, okay, what do you want to do with these? And they say, well, actually, this shows us that the timber at the time, this is the kind of phasing one would have been kind of ash or elm or something. We need some elm. So you think, oh, that works for me, but these charts don't work for me. But the data that they've gotten synthesized down then starts to let us kind of start to build some reconstructions based on the earlier site plans I did with the timber dating, and then start to put some elm, but in three-dimensional form. And then you can kind of send that back to them going, is this the kind of thing you want? And they go, oh yeah, actually, if we look at some of the black dots on the ground, they might be too thick. They might be too stylized. We need to thin it out, because some of the timbers are thinner than we think they are. So you go back and you wait for them to get back to you. But so the idea is you're always pushing forward or pushing back the data they give you to try and kind of stimulate and go, is this what you think it should be like? Is this what you want? 90% of the time it comes back slightly, they're not sure. And trying to get an academic to sign off is really hard sometimes, because they are putting the neck on the line. But I can walk away from it and just say, I was taught to do that. But to them, they've got to say, yeah, I'm actually putting my neck on the line, and I think this is right. And that's not easy sometimes. So we take the data sets, we take the dendro data sets, we then take the kind of flora and fauna data sets, and then if you're really geeky like me, you then start to build models of flowers and plants and stuff like that, which can be quite fun. And then once you've got them forever. You start to create what's called assets within 3D programs, and these can then be applied and then put in 3D reconstructions. So you have them, you then have to scatter them using physical particle systems. It's really fun. Honestly, it's really fun. But then you start to kind of develop the reconstruction and how it's going to sit and look and move forward. Then you start to get the structures kind of put in there as well. I've just been told 5 minutes, so I better speed up. So you start to kind of build the models, build the structures. You then start to get some of the data sets and add textures from the photographs that you got. And if you haven't got photographs, you can go out and take photographs yourself, like I do with trees and timber and things like that, and then apply the skins of the data sets to a lot of the information you got. And then once you start to create the basic models, you start to play around with a bit of light. This is where you get to be God a bit. You can move the sun around and kind of see how it looks really quickly. And then you then send it back to the specialist saying, right, this is the visual. This is how the light's going to sit. Does that work for you? They'll think about it for a long time and then might get back to you. And then if not, you just wait a lot of the time. So then you finalize the textures, you add doors on, which freaks them out a bit because they're really not sure about doors on roundhouses like this. But you kind of do it to kind of stimulate the debate, saying, well, it might have had a door on it, it might not. You then save the models as assets, which can be used in the programs and development. They're all done at 1-to-1, which is kind of good because the computer doesn't like that very much. And then you start the blocking out process again using the physical models that you've got, but based on the physical relationships of the site, which kind of hopefully helps the specialists understand what they're trying to show. So you then take some of the site plans, the lovely kind of phasing of it, and then you plot models on it, and then you go, right, there you go. There's the roundhouses. They're like, oh, they're really close together. Okay, we might need to think about this. Maybe the phasing that we've got of this site doesn't quite work with the data that we've got to work with when it's actually extruded out into a model. You then start to compile GIS data, LiDAR data to try and get hill chain models and maps put together. You have limitations on the topology. Sometimes you can use point cloud data to do that. So you start to create the terrain with the modeling that you've got. Sometimes you've got to use the data which exists now and then kind of work back with some of the environmental archaeologists to say, well, actually, some of these hills might have been slightly higher, slightly lower. So you're kind of playing God at morphing the topology around you, which is quite nice. But then you start to add that and apply that data to the actual images that you've got on screen so you can start to raise the ground up. So it's a very slow process. This final image wouldn't have all this data in it. You start to get some of the timber applied to it. And then you start to really kind of go to ground, and then you start to put some of the kind of the flora, fauna in there, and you get the different data sets in. But the idea is that you're trying to create a stimulating visual based on the data which is currently available to you at the time, which does change, at least the developments in science and going forward in 5 years' time. People might go, actually, your reconstruction is wrong. We need to develop that, which is absolutely fine because that's what you're trying to achieve. Now, the most important elements of a visual is how you're going to show it, what needs to be shown, and what do you need the viewer to see. So you set the scene. So this is a partial reconstruction, which is not quite finished yet, of the Crannog. But what I can do is I can set how it looks. I can change the light. I can change whether the ground has a path in it or not, because it doesn't there, but it does there, and the grass is really long. So the idea is that I get to play with a lot of kind of the visual of how I want to compose the scene, and the specialist will kind of guide me of what they're trying to show and guide the viewer's eye into to show people what they finally want to represent. You can start to do things like kind of add fisheye lenses in, but you finally get something like this. Now, this is important because I know this is not signed off because, as you can see towards the back, there's a plank missing. You'd fall through. But I have put this in, I've missed that out especially simply because I know that's not finished as a visual. And that plank needs to go back in when they sign it off. It's ready to go in, but if they sign that off now, it's like there's a plank missing, and they're not going to do that because the plank's missing. So the idea is that you kind of get to a halfway point going, is this ready? They go, yeah. I'll add that plank back in it again. So the idea is we have to consider the viewer, and it hopefully brings the past to life, which doesn't exist at all. Reconstructions help us do that, and it's a visual aid of what we're trying to do to kind of bring all of this information together. And it has to inform, hopefully provoke people to thinking what the past was like or not like. You get that all the time. You get kind of people saying, well, are you sure? And you're like, not really, no. But we think that's what it's like. But used properly and taken with lots of revisions into account, it evolves into new research. And it's seen as a controlled way of extending the knowledge. And I say controlled because you can set a point where a marker and say, right, this is what we think it's like, but it's not a fine, it's movable. This is what we think it's like with the data sets we have, and that changes over time. And hopefully it helps open up the idea of archaeology as a medium more than anything else. than text, because you look at something and everyone has a reaction to a painting, whether it's a Turner picture, whether it's one of my reconstructions. You might recoil at them. You might want to see muscly men in them. I don't know. That's possible. But everyone has a reaction instantly to a graphic, to a visual, where they don't necessarily have that with a text. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That's, I have to say, literally said 1,000 words. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, very interesting. Look, still working with 3D models, rendering 3D models. You ever get involved in virtual reality?
Yes, yeah. Photo capture. I do a lot of 3D scanning of artifacts, and a lot of that is used with megascan data. So you combine the actual physical, sometimes drone survey, 3D modeling, and actually put that in your reconstruction, and that helps a lot of the time. So with the topology of sites, we go out with the company I work for. We use a lot of drone data, and you can take that kind of point cloud data and actually use that as the start or the basis of your model. So it has all the texturing and lighting in there from, again, that snapshot of when they've done it. And that kind of helps massively, because you think, well, this is a good data set to start from, as opposed to a kind of blank piece of paper and thinking, well, we're not really sure what to do with this. But yeah, we do that all the time. I think that's the best way to do it, because sometimes starting with nothing is really hard, but starting from something is much easier a lot of the time.
But as a you think
No. Yeah, no, I haven't. We haven't. A lot of the time when it comes to the animations I do with the earlier slide I had with the pottery kiln with the guy, he's animated, he moves, but I didn't have time to render it overnight. It's going to take a lot longer. And they would kind of think, actually, maybe the kind of kiln fluid was a little bit longer because the guy's bending down. And the way the kind of physics work when you're kind of building the 3D models of people, it's actual proper physics. You know, the bones don't bend in a certain way. But again, that's what I hopefully try and do in my job, is stimulate this idea where they think, oh, actually, that might not be possible. But I think that's a really, really good idea, actually. I really do. Right. Yes, yeah. Sorry, the question to everybody online was, I forget it. It was it. Yeah, sorry. Using virtual reality to try and kind of help stimulate debate and it kind of influence what people think about site data, which might not actually work when they put it into practice.
Just putting the final plank in, having to kind of
100%. Yeah. It's true. It's what you do get asked that a lot. You see that people will say, actually, can you make the people a little bit smaller? Because what we think the evidence has, it should be bigger. But the evidence we actually have as archaeology doesn't kind of show that. But we think from what we have, it should either be bigger. So there is a lot of kind of manipulating the data sets that you actually have to kind of fit with the, I suppose, argument that the archaeologists are trying to put forward. So you do kind of have to kind of synthesize what people have and kind of use an archaeological filter to kind of filter out what might be possible. But ultimately, you're playing God with the data to kind of have a certain bias of what people want the public to see the site like, or what in their mind's eye of what they think the data sets are, how everybody else should see it. And I think that's kind of important is the kind of gatekeeper to some of that information, to make sure that it's open to interpretation and it's not set in stone, so people can look at it and go, actually, we're not sure if it should have been like that. So it's that stimulating, debating. I would hate the idea that people have it set in stone and think, well, that's it now. We've done it and there's a visual. The idea is that hopefully in not 5 years' time, 10 years' time, people might question the reconstruction with new evidence that's come forward and want to change that. So hopefully my idea is just to kind of show something quickly, which might stimulate debate and further research in the topic.